Hey guys, Mark here with another great episode of Retrocollecting 101. This episode is entitled The Game Boy. Hail to the King of Handhelds. To those that do know me personally as a retro collector, I do collect the Game Boy games. I personally think that they're very convenient. I do believe that they are still very fun to play even to this day. There's a few games that later on in this podcast I'll definitely recommend you guys. Um, Obviously, if you've seen my Instagram post and you've seen my Facebook posts, you'll know that I'll be talking about the Nintendo Game Boy. This goes for the Nintendo Game Boy all the way up to the Game Boy Color. So before we get that started, let's get the commercials out of the way first. Tonight's episode of Retro Collecting 101 is brought to you by Game Swappers. Game Swappers, buy, sell, and trade your retro games and next-gen consoles. That's Xbox One and PlayStation 4. You could come into contact with Game Swappers via Instagram at GAMESWAPPERS. That's at symbol GAMESWAPPERS. Game Swappers, buy, sell, and trade. Keep in mind, guys, that if you do share my Retro Collecting 101 podcast or my pay-per-review wrestling podcast or the very hilarious Mark and Andre show, you will get 10% off towards your game purchases through my sponsor, Game Swappers. Or you'll get 10% more towards your trade-in of any retro games or next-gen consoles as well. So if you guys do want discounts on some retro games, or if you want 10% more towards your trade-ins, be sure to screenshot the photo of you sharing my podcast through any iteration of social media, and then I'll be sure to make sure that you get a discount when you make a purchase or when you trade in your games. Anyway, I want to let you guys know about the Game Boy. The Game Boy was released in Japan on April 21st, 1989. It had a US release in July 31st, 1989, and it had a European release September 28th, 1990. The suggested retail price at the time for the Nintendo Game Boy was about $89.99. The launch titles for the Nintendo Game Boy were Super Mario Land, Alleyway, Baseball, Tetris, and Tennis. Those were the North American launch titles. The thing that the Game Boy did, as far as being a successful handheld, is very set in stone. There's not a lot of debate on who is the king of handhelds, but this podcast is here to help cement it a little bit more. The overall units sold for the Nintendo Game Boy was 118.69 million units sold. This is an outstanding number if you consider the rest of the competition, which I'll name in a sec. This Nintendo Game Boy had a black and white background. A lot of people do know that it has a green LCD, but the two main colors were basically black and white. The main color was black, and the shadows left exposed were the white background. Still, even with this most simplistic of design and the simplistic LCD, it still left a lot for imagination to flourish because it was, the games behind it were really great. Let's just put this in perspective with modern day units. With the 118.69 million units sold, think about this. The PSP, the PlayStation's version of their handheld, sold 82 million. 82 million units. And we're talking in a day and age of 2012, it was about 2010 when the PSP came out. And you have to think about this, is that the Game Boy sold 40 million more units than the PSP, especially in that day and age where you're able to advertise to a lot more broader market because of advertising. Back in the days of 1989, you had very limited cable advertisement. What you had to do at that time was advertise via newspaper, advertise via the cable TV, but it was very limited because certain cable television channels weren't available on certain regions, and so on and so forth. The PS Vita, which came out a little bit later, came out around let me see, the PS Vita came around 2012, 2013. And it actually came out to only about 4 million units sold. The Game Boy, here, let me put this in figures that you'll better understand, is that the Game Boy sold 30 times more units than the PS Vita. In the day and age where the PS Vita was actually around, we had social media. We had tons of it. We had MySpace. We still had the early success of Facebook, and then we still had YouTube. So there was really, what I really want to get at with the PSP and the PS Vita is that during this time, there was no excuse for you not to sell a lot of units with the console. It was a lot easier for someone to advertise around this time because you had a lot more broader market to advertise to. You had the internet, you had advertising on paper, and then you had advertising on cable and radio as well if you want to go to that route. But I mean, there's really no excuse for these two other units to not be as successful as the Game Boy. My perspective on the PSP and the PS Vita is that these consoles share the same fate as the Game Gear, and I'll get to what the Game Gear did wrong, and pretty much this is going to be the general synopsis of what every console did before the Game Boy and why they weren't as successful as the Game Boy, even during their times. But I still want to get through to some more handheld sales figures. So the Game Gear, the Sega Game Gear, was released in 1990, and it actually, to this day, sold only 10.5 million units. Back again, we're talking the Game Gear sold 10.5 million units. This is in comparison to the Game Boy, that's, the Game Boy sold 11 times more than the Game Gear did in 1990. And then the N-Gage from Nokia came out in 2003, had 3 million. The Atari Lynx in 1989 only sold roughly around 1 million units. These aren't, in some regards, these are substantial numbers. But when you have an executive board that looks to figures of the Nintendo Game Boy, which is 118 units, you're looking at a little bit of competition here that is so ahead of you that it's really hard to catch up. Keep in mind that these units sold, this 118.69 million, isn't really going to be up to par with the Game Gear because at that time, the Nintendo Game Boy probably sold a little more units than the Game Gear did at that time, but we're talking overall numbers here. We're talking about the lasting legacy of the Nintendo Game Boy itself. The Nintendo Game Boy, at the time of its release, really gave the platform for portable gaming. In 1989, you had the NES, Nintendo Entertainment System, but you had no other alternative as far as taking those games on the go, except if you had an RV or some other portable mode of transportation where you actually had electricity. But a game system that you could take on the go meant that most any demographic can easily pick it up and play the system wherever they go. This goes out to any age, and this is one of the points I want to make, is that the reason that the Game Boy was so successful was because any demographic was able to appeal to it. I mean, you had the older demographic that loved to play Tetris, you had the younger demographic that was familiar with Mario, and then you still had the teenage demographic that liked Link's Awakening and various puzzle and adventure games. So there was really a broad range of video games to feed off of if you enjoyed the Nintendo Game Boy. The tried and true design of the Game Boy was so effective that it took a whole 9 years before the Game Boy Color was released. You had different versions like the Game Boy Pocket and the Play It Loud series, with the Game Boy actually having several different colors as far as the actual design colors itself. But picture this, that it took another 10, almost about 10 years before the Game Boy was actually released in color. So you can imagine that the philosophy at Nintendo at the time is, if it's not broken, why try to fix it? Why try to make the design of the LCD a lot better now while we can still ride out this wave of different iterations? And that's why a lot of people That's what Apple is doing with the iPhone. That's why they make the iPhone 4 and then the 4S and then the 5 and the 5S and so on and so forth. Is that they can, sucker people into the half model before they go into the full numbered model. To answer the question, what did the Game Boy do that made it king of the handhelds? To build on the same point, it had effective marketing. It built off of the success of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and what I mean by that is that they used the franchise mascots. You're talking to your Super Mario's, your Metroids, the regular sports games, and they took the same success of those games and put them in handheld versions. So who wouldn't want to take Mario on the go? Who wouldn't want to take Samus from Metroid on the go? These games really help build a reputation for these handheld games. I also want to attribute, the fact, the tremendous sales on the simplistic design. It was compact and portable. Yes, the first Game Boy was a little bit big and bulky, but for it being the first design, you really had nothing else to go on. And it also appealed to every demographic. Like I said before, with so much variety in the games, you really had nothing to worry about as far as not selling a bunch of units per game. You had Tetris for the older demographic, you had Mario, the franchise mascots, and then you had the middle ground, which the adult to mid-teens. You had very difficult games for them as well. But the main point I want to get to is that the Game Boy was simply more affordable as well. The Game Gear at the time, when it was released, and that was 1990, it was $149.99. That was the MSRP for that. The Atari Lynx was $179.99, and that was around that time as well in the 1990s. The Neo Geo Pocket, still during that in 1999 when the Neo Geo Pocket was released, it came out to an MSRP of $69.95. But the Neo Geo Pocket was pretty much released at a later date where it's not really going to be a step ahead of the competition, because the Neo Geo, in my opinion, as far as the whole console and the portable goes, is that it's a very niche market for people. The Neo Geo actually appeals to people that actually can afford a Neo Geo first and foremost, and it can only appeal to a demographic that likes only mainly arcade games. So you're not really going to see a lot of people, bust out the Neo Geo Pocket from time to time. It is a rare console because it only had about a year and a half of release that it did. But to get to where I'm saying is that in 1989, for it being $89.99, as far as the MSRP goes, that means roughly, if you adjust it for inflation, that it was about $120 to $149 at that time. You could take that same formula for the Game Gear and the Atari Lynx. I mean, even with the Game Gear and the Atari Lynx at $149.99 and $179.99 respectively, this would take those two units over $200. And at that time, $200 was really a lot more expensive than it is today. But yes, those are the main points I wanted to get across of what makes the Game Boy so effective and so successful. As far as I tell people now, as far as games that I recommend, there's a few games that I do recommend for the Game Boy. Men and women will enjoy the Game Boy for the titles that they have. I mean, you have Double Dragon 1, 2, and 3. You have Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. You have Super Mario Land and Super Mario Land 2. Mega Man 1. I like Mega Man 1 more especially. Metroid 2, The Return of Samus, and then you also have Tetris. And last but not least, it's one of my favorite games for the Game Boy. You have The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. All of those games are still roughly around a broad price range, about $20 to $5, and you can find them fairly inexpensively. Just because these games move so many units, is that the price of these games aren't going to be that expensive, especially now since a lot of people are trying to collect these retro games. Luckily, these games came in such mass quantity, they're not going to be that expensive still in the time to come. Link's Awakening has still roughly been about $15 to $10, and Metroid 2 has been around $15 to $20. So it's kind of good to see that these aren't really going to rise up in price any much more. So it's good to see that. To those who do not have much time to play games and who still like to play the Game Boy, there's still some very good alternatives. You could focus your attention on trying to find emulators. You could do that, or you can even, if you want to go super retro on it. I mean, what you could do is forgive the play on words, but you can also just buy a Super Game Boy. If you have a Super Nintendo and you don't want to buy the Game Boy, that's simple. Just get a Super Game Boy, and it could still play the regular Game Boy games, but it also plays them in color. It doesn't play them off that that green screen that we're all used to. For the people that used to play the Game Boy in regular with the regular green screen, you don't have to worry about batteries. And if you're able to adjust the backgrounds, and you're able to adjust the various colors by using the L and R triggers to access the menus and to select from there. If you don't want to shell out the money for a Game Boy, buy a Super Game Boy. It's still around $20, and it really enhances the colors of the Game Boy games. Like I mentioned, it also has the cool features to where you can adjust the backgrounds. To this day, it's still the best. Let me get back to this. To this day, the Nintendo Game Boy is still the best-selling handheld that Nintendo has ever produced in history. 118 million units sold is a very outstanding number, especially since you consider at that time it was very hard for advertisers to actually expand to that kind of market. You got to imagine that the success of the Game Boy really came from the success of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Because if one person was able to play the Game Boy with their friend who had it, they could probably say, well, at least I could probably afford the Game Boy, and just go from there. From the one person that saw the Nintendo, they could probably, were able to afford the Game Boy at least. I mean, there's several theories you could go on, but I mean, think about this, guys. 118 million units sold before social media came out and before mass advertisement came out is a very impressive number. It shows you the longevity. It shows you the long tenure of success that Nintendo's had as far as handhelds go. You can even see short little, ripples of success within the Nintendo DS series. I mean, you have the DS, the DS XL, the 2DS, and the 3DS. I mean, you have all these other consoles that are being released by Nintendo, and they still mimic the same success. The Game Boy Advance sold 82 million units sold. I mean, I could just imagine what the Game Boy Advance SP sold. So, I mean, these improvements only go to show you that the Nintendo Game Boy was really the king of all handhelds, and it's still king to this day. So what I really want to get at, guys, is that if you guys really want to start getting into retro collecting, and you don't want to really spend a lot of money, but you really want to get some good, effective games, my advice to you is this: you can get a Super Nintendo, buy a Super Game Boy, and just play a bunch of Game Boy games. You're still looking at roughly about $5 to $10 as far as the asking price on some games. Yes, for the more popular games, you are going to pay a little bit more, but most of the popular games were released in mass quantities, and you're able to get them at a decent price. But that's the one thing I wanted to actually let you guys know about the Nintendo Game Boy. Me, myself, I do enjoy the Nintendo Game Boy myself, so it's very important that I do this podcast for you guys so you guys can be a little bit more informed and see how staggering these numbers are as far as sales go. But that concludes Retro Collecting 101 today. The Game Boy, the king of all handhelds. I'd like to let you guys know is that this episode of Retro Collecting 101 was brought to you by Game Swappers. Game Swappers, buy, sell, and trade your retro games and next-gen consoles. That's PS4 and Xbox One. You could come into contact with Game Swappers via Instagram at GAMESWAPPERS. That's GAMESWAPPERS. Game Swappers. Buy, sell, and trade. Keep in mind, guys, that if you do share Retro Collecting 101 or the pay-per-review wrestling podcast or the very hilarious Mark and Andre show, you will get 10% off towards your retro games or 10% more towards your retro game trade-ins. You share it through Instagram, Facebook. I don't care how you share it. Just share it. You take a screenshot of whatever you shared. Let me know, and then I'll make sure that I'll vouch for you if Game Swappers calls you out and make sure that this discount is actually valid. But other than that, guys, you guys have a good night. This has been another episode of Retro Collecting 101. Have a good night.